maybe pity, empathy, a little bit of concern, sorrow. Without even trying, you'd have some reaction to the visible condition I'm in. Many musicians realize not all physical injuries are visible, and we work hard to avoid invisible injuries such as carpal tunnel, back pain, hyperextension, tendinitis, and more. However, another physical limitation rarely discussed in the musical world is chronic illness, also called invisible disabilities. Today, my goal is to raise awareness of chronically ill musicians and equip teachers with ideas and practical tips to help chronically ill students fulfill their musical dreams. I will add that many of these topics are beneficial to any pianist, music student, or teacher, even if you have no chronic condition. Unfortunately, the only way to understand chronic illness is to live it. And since I don't want any of you to experience chronic illness, hopefully you can just learn from my experience. Before I jump into applying musical techniques with chronic illness, it is important to know what chronic illness even is. In discussing this, I must give two disclaimers. First, I am not in the medical or health profession, so this information is for educational purposes only. If you suspect that you, a student, or a friend has a complex chronic illness, I recommend finding a chronic illness literate doctor to work with the medical side of things. Second, I'm considerably new to the chronic illness life. I will be speaking primarily from my own experience, so please understand that each case of chronic illness has its own unique set of symptoms and challenges. So while I hope this information will be useful, realize that what works for me may not 100% work for another student. Now, what is chronic illness? It is not the same thing as chronic disease such as cancer, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, stroke, obesity, and some arthritis. Instead, many chronic illnesses are linked to autoimmune conditions, which the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences defines as when the immune system malfunctions and mistakenly attacks healthy cells, tissues, and organs. Chronic illness can also be rooted in genetic mutations. According to medtruth.com, it is estimated that 6 in 10 US adults have chronic conditions. So if there are 30 people here tonight, then percentage-wise, that means 18 of you would deal with a chronic condition. In peer-reviewed journal, Work, an article by Dr. Neelam Agarwal states, in 2016, an estimated 11% of undergraduate students, more than 2 million, report having some type of disability in higher education. The percentages of students with a chronic illness represents 17% of the students with disabilities in higher education. With these growing percentages, I believe it would benefit everyone to have a healthy awareness of what chronic illness is and how it manifests itself individually. There are hundreds of labeled chronic conditions and even more unlabeled. Just a few examples are autoimmune diseases, type 1 diabetes, celiac, Crohn's, some arthritis, lupus, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, multiple sclerosis, postural tachycardia syndrome, or POTS. My personal diagnosis is a mix of genetic mutations and autoimmune conditions. I have chronic fatigue, or ME/CFS, which manifests itself as a relentless exhaustion that doesn't go away with sleep or rest. It is potentially caused by the following conditions: chronic inflammatory response syndrome, or CIRS, which is a biotoxin illness that means I have a genetic predisposition to toxin hypersensitivity. Mold, chemicals, and other toxins can in essence make me bedridden. N95 masks can help a little bit, but it's kind of like using a low SPF sunscreen to slightly reduce sun damage. As a side note, mold is a huge issue. Most people understand that black mold is bad, but toxic mold can start growing in buildings at 55% humidity, which for us in Mississippi is every day. It can be in even brand new homes if the studs are too moist when the building is blacked in. For someone with a compromised system like mine and thousands of others, this mold prevents us from functioning well. I also have Bartonella, which is often a Lyme co-infection, though currently Lyme is unverified. Bartonella is aggressive bacteria that takes over certain white blood cells. Then there's this really long word that I'm not even pretend to try to pronounce. It's the MTHFR mutation for E, which basically just means my body doesn't properly process certain nutrients and chemicals, so they build up in my system. I also have unverified diagnoses dealing with food sensitivities, nutritional deficiencies, the musculoskeletal system, and more. If you're anything like me 2 years ago, you didn't know half of these words existed, and most of them probably just now went over your head. I'll simplify it in a moment, but before that, there's some helpful chronic illness lingo to know. As I've already mentioned, it's chronic illness and not disease, and it's also called hidden and invisible disability. There's a hashtag going around social media right now that's, but you don't look sick, or you don't look sick, to raise awareness of this. I use the terms crash and flare interchangeably. Sometimes it's caused by overdoing it, a change in weather, change in diet, change in medication and supplements, or we have no clue why. A crash can be a physical and mental inability to do basic tasks because of a heightening of symptoms. Those in a crash may be too tired to get out of bed to fix something to eat, even though they know they need the food to fuel their energy. They might make it back to the dorm room after class to sleep for 30 minutes, then spend an additional 30 minutes pep talking themselves to get up so they can just halfway function for the next class. They come back from an event and must rest for an hour to get enough energy to even go to sleep. They can hold a normal conversation and smile when their whole body hurts on a cellular level. Often, a crash comes as a delayed reaction. We call this post-exertion malaise, or PEM. In the moment, one might feel well enough to do something extra, so they do it. But the next day, they wake up and their body is screaming at them for attempting to do extra. Triggers are events that stimulate symptoms. Individuals learn to identify triggers to avoid the domino effect of symptoms tumbling out of control. Triggers can be perfume, chemical cleaners, food, or for me this last month, playing violin. Pacing is the easiest way to manage symptoms. It's basically like budgeting your energy for the day or the week. There is the spoon theory by Christine Miseradino, which is a helpful essay that can be found online. Basically, it explains limitations to healthy people. In essence, a healthy person might be given 100 spoons daily for activities, while those with chronic illness might only get 15 or 20. Each activity takes a spoon, and when you have no spoons left, you crash. So if you eat breakfast, get dressed, brush teeth, walk to the car, sit in class, 5 spoons are already used by 9 o'clock a.m. This is not a problem if you have 100 spoons. You've got 95 left to burn in the day. But if you only have 20 spoons, you only have 15 left to get through your day. Many with chronic illness have adopted this analogy and call themselves spoonies. Knowing the terms and familiarizing yourself with chronic illness lingo is a big step. But labeling an illness doesn't help me as a pianist, and it will not help you as a teacher or a friend. It is better to understand the symptoms and how they play out in everyday life so you know what you have to work around. Many of these symptoms are common, and some of you have probably experienced them at some level. Some physical limitations are chronic fatigue or low energy. It's not just tired. As I've already mentioned, it's a bone-deep exhaustion that doesn't go away with naps or sleep. It's probably similar to the feeling of getting just 2 hours of sleep each night, but chronic fatigue patients feel this way after 8 to 10 hours of sleep each night. Limited mobility manifests itself as clumsiness, slow reflexes, or muscles that feel so tired it takes 100% concentration to use them. There's reduced stamina. Practicing piano or walking for 10 minutes or driving for a half hour requires a break, and you're not always able to build up the stamina. Joint pain, where there feels like there's no cushion between your joints. Neuropathy or nerve damage, your limbs have numbness, tingling, weakness, you have less control. It's similar to the feeling if your foot or arm fell asleep, but with more pain, and it can last for a few days, weeks, or even months. There's light and sound sensitivity, migraines, vertigo and dizziness, all of which affect your ability to focus. There's heart palpitations, pain, insomnia, and digestive and hormonal issues. Added to the physical limitations, there are also mental limitations. Brain fog and cognitive impairment is a big one. It's like a mental block you can't force your way through. Words are just out of reach. or you need someone to explain how to do something in very simple steps, because otherwise it becomes too overwhelming because you can't keep all the pieces together. You might be present in body for an event, but you cannot remember anything that happened after the fact. I've been told by a variety of women that it basically sounds like pregnancy brain. There's poor concentration because it takes 100% focus to work past the physical limitations to even be somewhere. It sometimes leaves no room for actual mental work and concentration. This is by no means an exhaustive list of symptoms, as symptoms vary from individual to individual and even from day to day within one individual. Thankfully, my symptoms are extremely polite. They often take turns instead of invading on the same day. These symptoms are just provided so you have a general overview of this large and misunderstood topic. Over the last 2 years, I have faced the challenge of combining music and unpredictable symptoms head-on, figuring out how to make the two blend together in harmony. Because of the complexity and nuance of these illnesses, the general medical community's understanding of chronic illness is still incomplete and evolving. Given this state of things, as well as the divergence of medical opinions, it can be very difficult to find reliable information specifically connecting chronic illness in musicians. For a pianist, there are virtually no accessible articles about this subject. I know because I searched for hours. My first search on this subject began in January 2021. After being sick for a year, I reached a new low, physical, spiritually, and mentally. Playing piano for just 10 minutes required a 2-hour nap to recover from the exertion. I'm not a quitter, but at that point I was seriously going to drop out of college. If I could just find proof that it had been done, that would give me the hope to push forward despite my illness. So I searched pianists with chronic fatigue online, and I found one interview. It was a pianist who had to put aside their dreams because of chronic fatigue. I cried. During that time, I first heard the song by Josh Wright, which I played as my opening, which you could do with me, and I read Psalm 28:7, which says, "The Lord is my strength and my shield. My heart trusted in him, and I am helped. Therefore my heart greatly rejoiceth, and with my song I will praise him." The one article didn't give me any hope. However, God used the lack of information, coupled with the verse and song, to show me I didn't need that type of hope. What I needed was to follow him even if it was hard, and rely on him to pull me through. And even if it was just for 5 minutes at a time, I could still use my song to praise him. My discouragement of finding no examples of chronically ill musicians changed to an even greater determination to figure out how it could be done. It gave me a greater why to come to this point this evening for senior recital. Because somewhere out there is another pianist or musician facing a similar situation, and that person needs to know it can be possible to pursue your musical dream despite chronic illness. So yes, I will specifically talk about pianists with chronic illness. However, the technical, musical, and time management considerations are applicable to all music students. Non-musicians can use this knowledge to better understand the limitations of their friends with chronic illness. Selecting the repertoire for this recital was trial and error as we worked around managing symptoms and figuring out what music was even attainable. My initial health crash happened December 2019, my sophomore year. I had no energy by Christmas break, and I thought it was your usual college fatigue. I would sleep through Christmas break and bounce back in the new year. Instead, it was the explosion of underlying conditions from prior years and was just the start of my chronic illness life. In the first year, it took 3 different doctors to figure out the diagnoses of chronic fatigue and MTHFR mutation. But I wasn't given much hope that I would be able to overcome the symptoms. In December 2020, I found my current doctor who specializes in chronic illness. He chased down more plausible root causes and have provided protocols to help me take steps forward instead of backwards. Yes, I am still sick. The last 16 months have been a roller coaster, and we are still working on my unique case. But I know that if I had not found this doctor, I would have dropped out of college because of health issues. Most individuals with chronic illness spend at least 5 years, and some up to even 20 years, before they find a doctor who is literate to their specific root causes. So I am extremely blessed to have found a doctor so quickly. His expertise has played a huge role, enabling me to even reach the point of giving a senior recital. In the last 2.5 years, I've had to relearn the best way to practice piano and constantly adapt as different symptoms flare up. Sometimes hitting the reset button. This is something all musicians face at some point, so I know I'm not alone when I had to realize that no, I am not constantly restarting. The last 2 years have been building very slowly on a foundation that might hide during a health crash, but it will reappear when the symptoms fade. Getting back on the piano after a health crash of even 3 days is equivalent to returning to an instrument after a long vacation. Many musicians already know how to do this. We start with something simple and comfortable, and we gradually work into pieces that are more complex and require greater dexterity of mind and fingers. So for my senior year, I started back with Bach's Prelude in B-flat major from the Well-Tempered Clavier Book 1. It was easy to learn and did not require much physical movement, energy, or focus. It got me back on the piano while we figured out what my recital repertoire would be. As Dr. Murphy and I discussed potential pieces, we found several key components that made musical possible for me to learn. These components can also apply to music students in general who are struggling with a stressful year. First, the pieces must feel attainable to help with stress management. The most attainable music for me happens to be shorter pieces, which also helps with my concentration and stamina deficits. As any music student, I like music that is rewarding and motivating because it provides emotional support. Another important element of music is that which contains a variety of tempos. This freedom allows me to better work with my varying energy levels. Additionally, my personal preference is selecting repertoire of lesser-known composers. The first selection is by a composer many of you have probably never heard, Nikolai Medtner. He is a Russian composer contemporary of Rachmaninoff. I will be playing 2 selections from his collection, Forgotten Melodies, Opus 38. The entire collection is well worth listening to. It is diverse and unique, which piques my interest, and the shorter pieces make learning attainable. I narrowed it down to just 2 that I could learn based on ease of learning and energy needed to play. Number 2, Danza Graziosa, has a lyrical and playful melody that always makes me smile. As you can see, it is easily divided into very small segments to learn. By working on these smaller segments, I was able to build up the stamina and dexterity needed for the cadenza, something I could not physically handle when I started learning the piece. As Medtner indicates throughout the piece, the pianist is to play with much fluctuation of tempo, which works better for my energy levels than a piece that requires more consistent metronomical tempo. The beauty of this piece for someone with chronic illness is that it sounds amazing and is rewarding to play with a wide range of tempo fluctuations. Number 8, Alla Reminiscenza, is mentally rewarding because of the complex rhythms. Even though I struggle with brain fog, I still appreciate an analytical challenge, just within reason. The pattern of 8 against 3 was a sufficient challenge, and because the rhythm is consistent throughout the entire piece, it actually requires less mental energy than playing pieces with varying rhythmic patterns. The 8 versus 3 pattern also provides a built-in flexibility of sorts. Like Danza Graziosa, there was a section in this that had to wait while I built up stamina. The broad octaves on the second page pose a challenge for low energy days. One important technique that all pianists can utilize is allowing for the natural use of gravity rather than physical force to pull sound from the piano. This is a technique I did not learn until chronic illness forced me to, but I encourage all pianists to experiment with gravity versus manufacturing a loud sound. It is easier to give a large, broad sound when gravity is doing the work for you. I hope you enjoy the diverse colors of Medtner's selections. emploie une infante défunte. This piece is highly emotionally satisfying to me because of the familiar, stunning melody line. It is in rondo form, which means this melody returns several times and can easily be divided into sections to practice on low energy or higher energy days, as there are different levels of complexity each time the theme is presented. The introduction of the melody is simple, yet so beautiful that just the first page is rewarding to play. When you hear the theme the second and third times, even more textures are added to the inner voices. The layers of voices are a special challenge for any pianist. I redivided the notes to fit comfortably in my hands so I could use less energy and more easily highlight the melody. This concept of how to strategically divide complex passages between the hands so that it is easier to execute is highly valuable for all pianists, not just those with chronic illness. Additionally, working on the right hand alone to shape the melody was extremely beneficial. As pianists, we sometimes forget to work hands separate for artistic purposes, but I highly recommend it. Another fun hand-separate practice technique I challenge you to attempt is practicing opposite hands. For a season when I had to be cautious using my left hand due to nerve damage, I found practicing the left-hand part with my right hand was extremely beneficial, and it's something I would have never tried if I had not had that limitation that day. I hope you fall in love with this piece as much as I have. this information benefit you? I would be remiss not to give credit where it's due. I am equipped to share many of these thoughts because of Dr. Murphy's willingness and flexibility over the last 2 years of trial and error. I threw him a curveball and he made it into a home run. The fact that I'm graduating this month with a piano performance degree is largely due to him not giving up on me when I was ready to give up on myself. Thank you. This next he promised not to embarrass me, but I didn't promise the same. This next portion is a result of hours of our discussion and problem solving. First and foremost, be your student's biggest champion with a hefty dose of patience. Help the student find that happy place where they can thrive amidst the struggle and not just survive. In order to do that, you will need to take the time to understand the basics of your student's specific chronic illness so you know how to help them. If you don't know what daily symptoms they battle, you won't know their limitations. Along with that, you often need to trust your student's perception of their ability each day. Be a safe place where your student can discuss their struggles and limitations so you can work together as a team. Establish good, open communication. Some students may struggle to talk about their limitations in chronic illness, so find tactful ways to show them you care and want to help them. As a side note, to the individual silently suffering with an invisible disability or chronic illness, please don't be afraid to speak up. I know gaslighting makes many believe that it must be in my head, but if you struggle every day with things that should be simple and are not, it is not in your head. It is real. Most chronic illness is misunderstood and misdiagnosed. There are people, both in and out of the medical field, who don't believe that the conditions I have even exist. As a student, you have rights and accommodations to help you succeed, even with chronic illness. Trust me, it is worth speaking up. I can't even start to name all the people who have helped me and cared about my limitations more than I ever imagined. Back to the teachers. In addition to communicating what works for the individual student, realize that brain fog sometimes affects communication abilities, and on any given day, chronically ill students may not be able to formulate even common words and expressions. I have way too many examples of brain fog during lessons. Most often, the brain fog consumes my focus to where I walk out of the lesson and have no clue what we just discussed. Other times, I just have moments of brain fog, affecting only portions of the lesson. During one lesson, I knew I had a specific question about one section of music, but I couldn't figure out what that question was. So I thought, if I play this again, maybe that will help. So I played it, and without explaining anything, turned to Dr. Murphy and said, "That was my question." He's become pretty good at mind reading, but neither of us had any idea what question I was trying to ask. So accept that some days you may need to do the thinking and maybe even the decision making for your student. For instance, if your student struggles knowing how to best practice, you might need to work with them to break up their music into accessible goals. Be aware that there are many psychological aspects as well as physiological. Students with chronic illness often struggle with conflicting desires to do more than their body allows them. Be sensitive and encourage them to be sensitive to evaluate where they are. Depression and anxiety are additional aspects for those with chronic illness. However, we all realize these are not specific to those with chronic illness. Many of you either personally have depression and anxiety or have students struggling with them. This concept can apply to everyone. Let music be the element that relieves depression or anxiety, not triggers them. As I mentioned earlier, find repertoire that is rewarding and stress relieving. Help your student know and understand accommodations for your school system. If you're in a private studio, consider adapting strict guidelines such as the student can only skip 2 lessons before being dropped. Don't let your policy stand in the way of a student furthering their music education. For college students, point them to Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA.gov. It will give them grace for having bad days and relieve pressure. Always remember, piano or music is just one of the many complicated cogs in chronic illness lives. Some days, to have a good lesson or practice session, the student is altering other aspects of their lives. They might be taking extra naps, saying no to other events, not washing dishes, or adjusting their entire daily schedule just to function in lessons. There will be uncertainty, even with good medical care. As I've already mentioned, it can take years and multiple doctors to find a diagnosis. Even if an illness is managed or has gone into remission, one can still have unpredictable flares. All of this is a lot to consider and can be overwhelming, but find joy in discovering creative alternatives. View a chronically ill student as a positive challenge to help you grow as a teacher. Know what your student is capable of, but also meet their limitations with innovative solutions. One of the best ways to find solutions is to consider the options for each symptom. As a student, one of the first things to come up was the stress and difficulty of memorizing music. Given the day and my level of cognitive symptoms, it may not be possible to play by memory. Because of this, Dr. Murphy agreed to remove the requirement of memorized music for recital. If performance stress leads to a crash, consider pre-recorded recitals they can do in a stress-free environment. During lessons, provide a safe environment. If they have light sensitivity, use lamps instead of overhead fluorescent lights. If they have chemical sensitivity, don't use chemical cleaners, perfume, or cologne. Know what triggers their symptoms and try to avoid it. Balance activity with rest. If their stamina is low and they cannot tolerate playing more than 10 minutes, vary the lesson time with playing and talking, or schedule 2 shorter lessons in a week. Allow them to give a lecture recital in which they can vary energy exertion with speaking and playing. To help your student benefit the most from their lesson experience, encourage them to record lessons. This is an important tool for all musicians regardless of health status, so I'll say it again. Record your lessons. Recording lessons is especially valuable for those with chronic illness because we can re-listen to lessons and don't have to expend extra energy to take notes during lessons or rely on faulty memory. For my brain fog days when I had no clue what was discussed during lessons, listening to my recording later that week enabled me to still make progress even though my lesson day was rough. Another fun challenge is to experiment with different learning options. Realize your student may be relearning their learning process due to health complications. What worked for them in the past may not work for them today, so help them think of new ways for how they now learn music. Dr. Murphy and I have spent hours brainstorming efficient ways for me to practice utilizing less energy. One of the strategies I've newly implemented was listening to performances while studying and analyzing the notes. I personally like sight reading music from day one, but I found that, especially for the next piece I'll perform, listening to it a lot before even touching it even eased the vocal energy needed for learning notes, and it expedited the learning process. Even after I had it learned, it was still beneficial to listen to recordings while reading through the music on low energy days. Hopefully, some of these suggestions got your teacher brains ignited to be the problem solver for your student with chronic illness. As with all students, keeping a positive attitude and helping students realize progress is vital. Small steps of progress are always worthy goals in which to rejoice. My final piece, Variations on Balkan Themes by Amy Beach, provided many small steps of progress, as each variation is just 1 or 2 pages long. While I one day hope to perform the entire set, today I am playing only a selection of the variations. As I started learning, I found it easiest to focus on the more accessible variations first. While these are challenging to execute well, several of the variations are easier to learn and read. I started learning the less complex variations while listening to professional recordings of the more challenging variations. Variation 2 has the most activity with arpeggios and octaves. As with Medtner's Alla Reminiscenza, utilizing gravity here was advantageous. Variation 5 is left-hand dominant, where the left hand usually reads 2 staffs, and the 3rd staff is added for the right hand. I practiced this in a way that would benefit all pianists. When the left hand reads 2 staffs, as here at the beginning, I practiced it several times with the right hand on the upper staff and the left hand on the lower staff. This enabled me to learn the notes more easily, as well as hear the sound I wanted to execute with just one hand. In a way, Variations on Balkan Themes has a somewhat autobiographical context for me, as the variations I'll play for you today are an inspiring representation of ideas and emotions: somber, exciting, thoughtful, mournful, and hopeful. I have resonated with all these feelings deeply over the last year as I have gotten to know the variations better. It is my desire in sharing these pieces and thoughts with you tonight that you'll walk away having learned something beneficial that will equip you to help others who are struggling with the tumultuous balance of chronic illness and music. And maybe you found something helpful to apply to your own life as well. Enjoy Amy Beach's Variations on Balkan Themes.
Thank you.